The pirate's final journey lasted only minutes, yet it carried the weight of an entire life beneath the black flag. The same man who had once commanded cannon, ordered boarding parties, and trusted swift sails to escape pursuit, now knelt helplessly before a wooden block. One stroke ended what storms and naval guns had failed to destroy. But the execution was meant for the living as much as the condemned. Every sailor watching understood the warning. Treasure, speed, and terror could build a legend across the Atlantic, but capture could reduce that legend to chains, a scaffold, and the executioner's blade.
Enjoy the video, and don't forget to subscribe.
Trace your finger along the map from the Caribbean across the storm-beaten Atlantic toward the crowded execution ports of 18th century Europe, and picture an age when the smell of rotting oak, wet hemp, boiling pine tar, human sweat, stagnant bilge water, and burned black powder followed captured pirates from their ships to the scaffold. Among the most terrifying punishments was public beheading, designed not merely to kill an outlaw, but to transform his final seconds into political theater before thousands of spectators. Long before the condemned man reached the execution ground, piracy had been constructed aboard vessels whose white oak hulls depended upon enormous curved futtocks locked around the keel, planking driven tight with hand-forged iron spikes approaching 12 inches in length, and seams packed with twisted oakum before being sealed beneath heated pitch. Pronounced tumble-home narrowed the upper works, while repeated careening removed weed, barnacles, and shipworm damage below the waterline. A captured merchantman might be converted under Articles of Agreement, its crew operating beneath rules governing shares of plunder, compensation for wounds, discipline, and command. Some captains had originally sailed legally under letters of marque before crossing the narrow boundary separating sanctioned privateering from piracy. Their cannon could weigh more than a ton bronze pieces commonly cast from copper-rich alloys strengthened with roughly 10% tin, while their coarse black powder combined approximately 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. When flame entered the vent, rapidly expanding gases hurled iron shot outward with enough energy to crush oak fibers, tear planks from their fastenings, and transform splintered timber into lethal fragments. Yet for one captured pirate, the violence of the sea would eventually give way to something deliberately slower. A guarded procession through screaming spectators toward a raised wooden platform, a waiting executioner, and the polished edge of a heavy blade. By dawn on the appointed execution day, the waterfront had become a theater of punishment. Merchants abandoned counting houses, apprentices slipped away from workshops, sailors crowded tavern windows, and vendors pushed through gathering spectators while soldiers established a corridor toward the scaffold. Public executions attracted enormous audiences because authorities understood that punishment became more powerful when witnessed. The condemned pirate emerged under guard with his wrists restrained, hearing church bells, shouted insults, boots striking cobblestones, and the distant groaning of ships against their mooring lines. Those vessels represented the world he was leaving behind. Capstans scarred by anchor cable, deadies tightening salt-stiffened shrouds, chain plates transferring the strain of standing rigging into the hull, mast partners supporting spars that could rise more than 70 feet above the water, and breaching ropes thick enough to restrain cannon recoil after discharge. His crimes were proclaimed publicly. Raiding merchant shipping meant more than stealing cargo. A captured vessel represented months of labor, thousands of pounds in invested capital, and sometimes more than 100 tons of timber, iron, canvas, provisions, and merchandise. Witnesses could describe boarding actions in which grappling hooks locked gunwales together while muskets fired across decks scarcely 20 feet apart. Black powder flashed inside priming pans, sulphurous smoke obscured the rigging, and round shot striking oak compressed the grain before rupturing it violently along natural fibers. Now every technical advantage that had once protected the pirate was useless. No quartermaster could invoke the Articles of Agreement, no helmsman could turn the ship toward open water, and no letters of marque could transform prosecution into legitimacy. At the scaffold, the executioner's equipment waited in full view. The wooden block stood approximately knee-high, positioned so the condemned man's neck could be extended across its upper surface, while beside it rested the broad steel blade, whose weight depended not upon gunpowder or wind, but upon a single accurately delivered human stroke. The pirate climbed the scaffold beneath a roar from the crowd, each plank flexing beneath his boots while soldiers closed around the platform. The executioner inspected the blade, a heavy forged steel instrument ground into a broad cutting edge and balanced for a descending two-handed stroke. Unlike hanging, beheading demanded precise positioning. The prisoner was brought toward the block, his restraints preventing any sudden movement, while an official read the sentence over the noise of spectators. Beyond the scaffold, harbor masts formed a forest of spars and rigging, reminders of the vessels he had once commanded. Their hulls had survived Atlantic storms because oak futtocks distributed enormous stresses through frames, lodging knees reinforced deck beams, and tarred hemp shrouds stabilized the masts against violent rolling. None of that engineering could protect him now. He lowered himself before the block as the executioner stepped behind him, tested his footing, raised the blade, and waited for the final signal. The signal came, and the executioner lifted the steel high enough to convert its weight into devastating momentum. For an instant, the crowd seemed to contract around the scaffold, thousands of eyes fixed upon one movement. The blade descended rapidly, driven by gravity and the executioner's shoulders, striking the exposed neck against the rigid block. Contemporary public punishment depended upon this horrifying visibility. Authorities wanted sailors watching from the harbor to understand that piracy could end not with treasure buried beneath palms, but beneath an executioner's blade. A roar spread through the spectators as the sentence was completed. Soldiers remained positioned around the platform because crowds at major executions could surge dangerously close. Nearby ships creaked against their cables, their dead-ease, chain plates, ratlines, and tarred standing rigging moving in the wind. The contrast was deliberate. Beyond the scaffold waited the same sea that had once offered escape, while on land the state had converted one pirate's death into a warning intended for every sailor considering the black flag. Death did not necessarily end the punishment. Authorities understood that a pirate's remains could continue communicating long after the scaffold had emptied. The sentence might therefore include public display, burial in unconsecrated ground, or exposure near the waterfront where sailors entering port could see the consequences of piracy before stepping ashore. Execution sites were deliberately connected to maritime traffic. Every arriving deck carried men familiar with articles of agreement, letters of marque, mutiny, prize money, and the temptation of cargoes worth fortunes. A merchant ship of 200 tons could carry sugar, tobacco, silver, textiles, or spices valuable enough to persuade desperate sailors to abandon legal wages. Yet the same harbor contained naval patrols armed with cannon whose powder charges transformed burning grains of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur into expanding gas within milliseconds. Pirates could outrun heavy warships, exploit shoal water, or careen their vessels on isolated beaches, but capture transferred the struggle from seamanship to law. The scaffold demonstrated where that struggle could finish. As evening settled over the harbor, the cheering crowd finally dispersed through streets, still carrying the smells of smoke, salt, tar, horses, and tidal mud, but the execution ground remained visible from the anchorage. Sailors returned to ships where watches changed beside loaded cannon, lanterns swung beneath deck beams, and bilge water moved between frames assembled from massive oak futtocks. The condemned pirate had once trusted speed, intimidation, and the enormous geography of the Atlantic to keep authorities distant. A fast sloop drawing only several feet of water could disappear through shoals inaccessible to heavier naval vessels. Fresh careening could reduce drag. Carefully tensioned dead-ease could strengthen standing rigging, and disciplined gun crews could fire iron shot through enemy planking before a merchant captain organized resistance. Yet none of those advantages survived capture. The blade had accomplished something cannon fire could not. It transformed one outlaw into a public warning. The spectators had cheered because execution was deliberately presented as spectacle, while officials wanted every sailor watching to carry the memory back aboard ship. Beneath the black flag, piracy promised shares of captured silver and freedom from merchant discipline. Beneath the scaffold, the state offered its final answer. The sea could make a pirate wealthy, feared, and legendary, but once chains closed around his wrists, his last voyage might measure only the distance from a prison door to a wooden block.